The water in my parents' basement was up to my shins, and it smelled like copper and rot. I was shivering, trying to plug a burst pipe with my bare hands, while my father stood on the stairs clutching a stack of hospital bills. He was weeping, telling me if I didn't find $5,000 by midnight, my mother would die. I believed him. I'd worked 3 jobs for 5 years to keep them alive. But then my wrench slipped. It smashed a hole through the drywall, revealing a hidden firebox. Inside wasn't a miracle. It was a ledger. My parents weren't poor. They were millionaires. And every hour of backbreaking labor I'd done was being billed as a tax-deductible expense for their shell company. I wasn't their son. I was their offshore investment. And now they've realized I know. There is a black SUV outside, and they've already signed the papers to have me committed at dawn. Let me take you back to the moment the pipe burst. Rust-colored water swirled around Ethan Miller's shins, soaking through his denim and leaching the heat from his bones. He gripped the pipe wrench, knuckles white, as a rhythmic spray hissed from the hairline fracture in the main. The basement smelled of damp concrete and ancient rot. Every time he tightened the bolt, the metal groaned, resisting his efforts to silence the leak. Ethan counted the stairs leading up to the kitchen out loud, a whisper lost in the roar of the water. 1, 2, 3. He needed to know the exit was there. When he was 6, he had tumbled down a flight just like those while his parents slept off a migraine, and the world had spun into a blur of pain. Now, the counting was the only thing that kept the basement walls from closing in. Arthur's polished Oxfords clicked on the top step, out of reach of the rising tide. He slapped a thick envelope against his palm, a sharp, percussive sound that echoed off the low ceiling. Arthur didn't look like a man dying of a respiratory ailment. He looked like a man presiding over a court. He tapped his cane against the wood in a rapid pattern. Tap, 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 tap. One for each brother he'd lost to the fire, a rhythm he believed kept the reaper at bay. The contractors estimated $20,000 for the foundation, Ethan. You're playing plumber while the house sinks. Ethan didn't glance up. He braced his shoulder against the cold brick, muscles straining as he forced the wrench another quarter turn. Water sprayed his cheek, stinging like a needle. The foundation holds if the water stops. The water stops when the bank owns the deed. Arthur tossed the envelope. It skidded across the gritty surface of a floating workbench before splashing into the murky pool. The yellow paper bloated instantly, ink bleeding into the gray water. Foreclosure notice. Served 10 minutes ago. I told you the bridge loan was a mistake, but you insisted on saving the family legacy. The wrench slipped. Ethan's hand slammed into the jagged edge of a pipe bracket. He hissed, pulling his palm to his chest as crimson streaks marbled the floodwater. The hiss of the pipe grew into a roar, the hairline fractures splintering into a jagged maw. Arthur didn't move to help. He simply straightened his silk tie and turned toward the stairs, leaving Ethan submerged in the cold, dark ruins of his own persistence. The vibration of a phone in Ethan's pocket felt like a hornet against his thigh. He fumbled it out with slippery fingers, the screen smeared with basement grime. It was Marcus Reed, his supervisor at the warehouse. Ethan's heart did a slow, heavy roll in his chest. He was already late for the morning shift. "Miller?" Marcus's voice crackled, sharp as a razor. "I'm looking at the floor. Do you know what I don't see? I don't see you. I see 5 pallets of unboxed electronics sitting in the loading bay. I see a gap in the schedule that looks exactly like a liability. Now, Marcus, I'm sorry. The pipes... I don't care about your plumbing, Ethan. I care about the data. Your performance metrics are sliding into the red. you fell asleep during the inventory count yesterday. If you aren't here in 20 minutes, don't bother coming in at all. The company doesn't run on excuses." Ethan watched Marcus's hand in his mind's eye, imagined him tugging his tie 3 times, once for the rules, once for the career, once for the father who had raised him to be a machine. As the line went dead, a second notification popped up. A text from Sarah. Ethan's thumb hovered over the glass. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I'm tired of being second to a house that's already dead. I'm tired of apologizing for things I didn't break. I'm leaving for the city tonight. Don't call. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The word sorry seemed to echo in the damp air, the sound of a woman who had apologized herself into non-existence. Ethan felt a hollow ache where his future used to be. He was trapped between a drowning basement and a world that was moving on without him. He looked at the water, then at the stairs. 4, 5, 6, he whispered, his voice cracking. He had to get out. He was wading toward the stairs when the basement door creaked open again. It wasn't Arthur this time. It was Michael Davis, the neighbor from 3 doors down. Michael was a man who lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance, his pockets always bulging with notebooks full of timestamps and license plate numbers. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the shadows of the basement. "Ethan! Ethan! Get out here!" Michael hissed, slapping his breast pocket where his ledger sat. "I got the time, the date, and the plate number. 8:14 a.m. Black Tahoe. They're on the lawn, Ethan. They think your truck is the one they're looking for." Ethan scrambled up the stairs, his wet boots squeaking on the linoleum of the kitchen. He burst through the front door into the gray morning light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and exhaust. A massive man in a neon yellow vest was already hooking a chain to the front axle of Ethan's battered Ford. "Hey, that's my truck," Ethan shouted, lunging across the wet grass. The man, James Wilson, didn't even look up. He was a mountain of a man, his skin the color of oak bark, his knuckles stained with grease. He crunched a green apple candy between his teeth, a sharp, violent sound. "Repo order 402, kid. Move aside. You've got the wrong house. I don't owe anything on that truck." Ethan reached for the man's arm, but James was faster. With a grunt of effort, James spun and slammed Ethan into the sodden turf. The impact knocked the wind out of Ethan's lungs, the cold mud seeping into his shirt. James pinned him down, a heavy knee pressing into Ethan's chest. For a second, Ethan saw stars. He reached into his back pocket, his fingers slick with blood from the pipe bracket injury, and shoved his wallet into the man's face. "Look at the damn ID!" Ethan wheezed. James squinted at the blood-stained card. He looked at the truck, then back at the paperwork on his clipboard. He crunched another candy, the sound like a bone snapping. He let go of Ethan's collar and stood up, his eyes darting to the red, past due stamp on his folder. "Not Miller?" James muttered. "The order is for a Miller at 412. This is 414. He didn't apologize. He just unhooked the chain with a series of metallic clanks that set Ethan's teeth on edge. "Watch your step, kid. People around here are looking for reasons to take what's yours." Ethan lay on the grass for a long minute, watching the black Tahoe roar away. His jaw ached where it had hit the ground, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He felt small. He felt hunted. He dragged himself up and trudged back into the house, the foretap of his father's cane echoing from the floor above. Back in the basement, the water had slowed to a sluggish trickle, but the damage was done. Ethan picked up the heavy pipe wrench, his movements mechanical. He needed to vent his frustration, to hit something that couldn't hit back. He swung the wrench at a bulging section of the drywall near the workbench. a spot he'd meant to patch for years. The metal head of the wrench didn't just dent the wood. It smashed through it with a hollow, splintering crack. Ethan paused, frowning. There shouldn't have been a void there. He pulled away a jagged chunk of plaster and reached into the dark space behind the wall. His fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. Metal. He hauled it out. A heavy, waterproof firebox, gray and utilitarian. It felt surprisingly heavy in his hands. He set it on the workbench, the water dripping from its lid. He expected to find old tax returns, maybe his own birth certificate, or the deed to the house Arthur claimed was in peril. He pried the latch open. Inside, there were no family photos. Instead, there was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a series of bank statements from institutions Ethan had never heard of. Banks in the Caymans, in Zurich, in places that didn't care about a leaky basement in a gray American city. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars, moved in increments that matched the medical bills Arthur had been crying about for a decade. The first twist hit Ethan like a physical blow to the stomach. His parents weren't broke. They weren't fighting foreclosure. They were wealthy, wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. And they had watched him work himself to the bone, watched him skip meals and lose the woman he loved, all to protect a legacy that was nothing but a profitable lie. Ethan sat on a milk crate, the ledger open on his knees. The air in the basement felt different now. Colder, sharper. The triple wash of the pipes rattled above him. On, off, on, off, on, off. His mother was awake. She was proving her fragility to the house, unaware that her son was holding the evidence of her betrayal in his blood-stained hands. He stayed there for an hour, the numbers burning into his retinas. He heard the front door open, Arthur coming back from his appointment. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the lie. Ethan tucked the ledger back into the box, but he didn't put it back in the wall. He hid it under a pile of oily rags in the corner. He wasn't ready to scream yet. He needed to know how deep the rot went. Ethan. Eleanor's voice drifted down the stairs, thin and wavering like a frayed wire. Ethan, please, I need you. He climbed the stairs, 1, 2, 3, and found her in the kitchen. She was clutching a damp handkerchief, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked like a woman on the verge of collapse, her skin papery and pale in the harsh fluorescent light. The doctor called, she whispered, her voice trembling. The cardiac trial, Ethan. They said if we don't have the $5,000 deposit by midnight, they'll give my spot to someone else. I don't want to die, Ethan. I'm so scared. Ethan looked at her. He looked at the way she twisted the handkerchief. He thought of the millions in the firebox. 5,000, he repeated, his voice flat. And the bank, Arthur added, appearing in the doorway. He leaned heavily on his cane, his cough rattling in his chest. They put a new lien on the house this morning. Some old debt from the business. If we don't show them we're making an effort, they'll lock the doors by Monday. The pressure was a physical weight now, a suffocating blanket. Ethan felt a surge of cold fury, but he kept his face a mask of exhaustion. I'll see what I can do, he said. I'll talk to Marcus about an advance. He walked out to his truck, but he didn't go to the warehouse. He sat in the cab, staring at the house. He noticed something he'd missed before, a black SUV idling at the corner of the residential street. It was the same one Michael Davis had mentioned. It sat there, its windows tinted dark, a silent predator in the suburban gray. When he tried to start the truck, the steering wheel felt heavy, dragging to the left. He got out and looked down, All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping like open mouths. A message. A warning. The house wasn't a home. It was a cage, and the bars were being electrified. He began to walk toward the pharmacy, the only place he could think to go to clear his head. The city felt oppressive, the skyline a heavy lid closing over the streets. The smell of burnt diesel clung to his throat. As he walked, he felt eyes on his back. Every twitch of a curtain in the darkened windows of the residential street felt like a sniper taking aim. The pharmacy was a chaotic blitz of neon and noise. The high-pitched ding of the counter bell sliced through his brain. He stood at the counter, watching Jennifer Lopez, the technician, as she scanned bottles. She was humming "Happy Birthday" under her breath, a rhythmic, haunting sound. "I need to talk about the pricing on my mother's heart meds," Ethan said, leaning against the glass. Jennifer looked up, her eyes tired but kind. She recognized the desperation in him. "Mr. Miller, we've discounted it as much as the system allows. It's a specialty compound. Without insurance, it's..." "I know what it is," Ethan snapped, then softened. "Please, just check again." Jennifer leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Ethan, look at me. I shouldn't tell you this, but I've seen your mother's file. The medication you're buying? It's a high-priced vitamin supplement. It's not for the heart. It's a placebo used for patients who, well, for patients who want to feel like they're being treated." The world tilted. Ethan felt the floor go soft beneath his boots. Another lie. A $500 a month vitamin. He turned and stumbled out of the store, his mind a whirlwind of numbers and betrayals. He took the shortcut through the alley, a narrow canyon of brick and rusted fire escapes. The smell of sour garbage was thick enough to taste. He was halfway through when 2 figures stepped out from behind a dumpster. One was Kevin Smith, a wiry man with a lucky gold tooth that flashed in the shadows. He smelled of cheap cigarettes and expensive cologne. He was picking at his cuticles, leaving small red dots on a white handkerchief. "Ethan Miller," Kevin sneered. "We've been looking for you. Your old man says you're the one holding the purse strings." "I don't know who you are," Ethan said, backing away. "We're the interest on the debt, kid," the second man said. He was larger, a shadow with a heavy coat. Arthur borrowed 10 large for a business venture. He said his son was a hard worker. Said his son would make sure we got paid. Ethan felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not duty, just raw, unadulterated rage. He saw a heavy wooden pallet leaning against the brick wall. Subverted beat 1.08. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew every inch of this alley. He'd been dodging bullies here since he was 10. He lunged for the wooden pallet, his fingers gripping the rough, splintered slats. He swung it with the practiced strength of a man who moved 6,000 units of steel a week. The heavy wood caught the larger man in the chest, the impact sounding like a wet sack of flour hitting the pavement. "Get him!" Kevin shrieked, his gold tooth flashing as he lunged forward. Ethan didn't back down. He felt a surge of cold, calculated confidence. He used the pallet as a shield, jamming it into Kevin's ribs and pinning him against the brick. This was the smart play. Use the environment, use the weight. He felt a moment of pure, crystalline victory as Kevin gasped for air, his white handkerchief fluttering to the oily ground. Ethan had them. He was stronger, faster, and he had the moral high ground. He felt his shoulders drop, his breathing steadying. He was going to walk out of this alley a free man. "Who sent you?" Ethan demanded, his voice steady. "Was it the bank?" Kevin started to laugh, a wet, hacking sound that ended in a spray of red on his chin. "The bank? Kid, you really are the golden goose, aren't you?" He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a folded piece of paper. He flicked it toward Ethan. "Read the signature, genius." Ethan's grip on the pallet faltered. He picked up the paper with one hand, his eyes scanning the lines. It wasn't a loan agreement. It was a collection contract for a gambling debt. At the bottom, in the elegant, flowing script he had seen on 1,000 get-well cards, was his father's signature. But it wasn't the signature that stopped his heart. It was the date. The debt hadn't been incurred years ago. It had been signed 3 days ago, the same day Ethan had skipped lunch to pay for the emergency plumbing supplies. "He didn't borrow the money to save the house, Ethan," Kevin said, dabbing at his bleeding lip. "He borrowed it to bet on the ponies in Jersey. He told us you were good for it. He even gave us your work schedule so we wouldn't miss you. He said, and I quote, 'My son lives to serve. Just give him a little nudge.'" The truth hit Ethan like a physical blow to the throat. He felt the world tilt, the walls of the alley leaning inward. His father hadn't just lied about being poor. He was actively using Ethan as collateral for his own greed. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a predator, and Ethan was the prey. The pallet felt heavy, useless. He let it clatter to the ground. The two thugs didn't even move to strike him. They didn't have to. The betrayal had done more damage than any punch ever could. Ethan stood in the sour-smelling dark, realizing that every drop of sweat he'd shed for his family had been fuel for his father's vices. He was in a worse position than he'd been 5 minutes ago. Now he didn't just have a debt. He had the knowledge that his own father had sold him out to sharks for a chance at a trifecta. He stumbled out of the alley, his knees weak. The black SUV was still there, a block away, watching. He realized now it wasn't the bank. It was them. They were waiting to see if the nudge worked. He made it back to the house, his mind a cold, dark place. He went straight to the basement, ignoring the foretap from the ceiling. He pulled the firebox out from under the oily rags. There was a small silver USB drive tucked into a velvet pocket in the lid. He hadn't noticed it before. He sat at his old laptop, his fingers trembling as he plugged the drive in. The screen flickered, the blue light washing out his skin. A password prompt appeared. He tried his mother's birthday. Nothing. His father's? Nothing. Then he remembered the door. The one they said he'd left open when he was 7. 072298. The folder opened. It wasn't just bank statements. It was a meticulous ledger for a shell corporation called Miller & Son Logistics. Ethan's breath hitched. He had never heard of it. He opened the first document. It was a service invoice for manual labor, inventory management, pipe repair, grounds maintenance. He scrolled down, the numbers blurring. Arthur had been billing Ethan's daily chores and warehouse shifts as tax-deductible business expenses through this fake company. Every hour Ethan spent fixing the house, every dollar he earned at the warehouse and handed over for bills, was being funneled through this corporation to wash the money Arthur was winning and losing at the track. Ethan wasn't just a son. He was an unpaid intern in a family-run fraud scheme. He was a tax break, a line item on a spreadsheet. The phone rang. Marcus Reed. "Miller, don't bother coming in tomorrow or ever. I've reviewed the footage from the loading dock. You were distracted, you were slow, and frankly, you're a liability to the insurance premiums. Your final check will be mailed. Don't come back to the property." Click. Ethan stared at the screen. He was 29 years old. He had no job, no girlfriend, no truck, and his parents were millionaires who viewed him as a mule. He felt the triple wash rattle the pipes above him, on, off, on, off, on, off. He stood up and walked to the study. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Thud-tuck, thud-tuck. He found Arthur's old Bible on the desk, the leather worn and cracked. He flipped through the pages, looking for the passwords. He found them tucked between the book of Job and the Psalms, a handwritten list of codes and account numbers. He was staring at them when the door creaked. Arthur stood there, the brass lamp in his hand, casting long, distorted shadows. He wasn't leaning on his cane. He stood tall, his eyes cold and sharp. "You shouldn't have gone in the wall, Ethan," Arthur said. His voice was no longer a rattle. It was a low, dangerous growl. "We had a good thing going. You had a purpose. You were the hero of the story, saving your poor, dying parents. Don't you like being the hero?" "You lied about everything," Ethan whispered. "The trial, the house, the debt." "I gave you a reason to get out of bed," Arthur snapped. "Without me, you're just another grunt in a warehouse. I made your life meaningful." He stepped into the room, the brass lamp swinging at his side. "But now, you're becoming a problem, and problems have to be solved." He reached into his pocket and tossed a folder onto the desk. Ethan opened it. It was a life insurance policy. A big one. $5 million, accidental death. The beneficiary was Arthur Miller. "And here's the best part," Arthur said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I've been keeping a diary, a record of your episodes, your violent outbursts. The neighbors have seen you fighting on the lawn. They've heard you shouting in the basement. When the police find you, it won't be a murder. It'll be a tragedy. A mentally ill son who finally snapped." He lunged. The brass lamp whistled through the air, narrowly missing Ethan's temple. They crashed into the desk, pens and papers flying. Ethan felt the old man's strength. It wasn't the strength of a sick man, but the desperate, wiry power of a cornered rat. They tumbled onto the floor, shattering a glass side table. Ethan pinned Arthur's arms, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You're going to kill your own son for a payout?" "I'm going to retire," Arthur hissed, trying to gouge Ethan's eyes. "I'm going to Tuscany. I'm going to live the life I deserve." Ethan shoved him back, scrambling to his feet. He saw the folder on the desk, the one Arthur had been working on. He grabbed it and ran for the stairs. He didn't stop until he reached the basement, slamming the door and sliding the bolt home. He fumbled through the folder. It wasn't just the insurance policy. There were papers from a state psychiatric facility, signed, dated for tomorrow morning. Involuntary commitment. They weren't just going to kill him. They were going to erase him. If the insurance thing didn't work, they'd just lock him away and keep the money flowing. He sat in the dark, the water still dripping from the pipes. He heard them upstairs, whispering, planning. 1, 2, 3. Ethan whispered. But he wasn't counting stairs this time. He was counting the ways out. He knew this house. He knew every structural weakness, every hidden gap. He had spent 10 years fixing it. Now, he would use that knowledge to break free. He crawled into the crawl space behind the furnace, his fingers finding the latch to the ventilation shaft he'd repaired 3 years ago. It was narrow, smelling of dust and old metal, but it led to the exterior grate near the rose bushes. He squeezed inside, the cold metal biting into his shoulders. He emerged into the night air, the grass damp against his face. He didn't look back. He ran. The 24-hour internet cafe was a cavern of blue light and the hum of cooling fans. Ethan sat in a corner cubicle, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He used the passwords from the Bible. He accessed the offshore accounts. He didn't take everything. He was a counter, after all. He calculated his exact earnings for the last 10 years. He added the interest he would have earned. He added a 10% pain and suffering fee. He transferred the total, $342,000, to a new encrypted account in his own name. He left the rest. He left them with exactly $12.42. The price of a large pizza and a bottle of cheap soda. The price of the life they had pretended to live. Then he opened a new email window. Subverted beat 4.3. Ethan felt a surge of cold, righteous power as he attached the files from the USB drive. The Shell Corporation ledgers, the fake invoices, the tax evasion records. He addressed it to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This was the final blow. By exposing the fraud, he wasn't just getting even, he was purifying himself. He was the whistleblower, the honest man standing up against the corruption that had nearly swallowed him whole. He felt a sense of profound relief, a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt since he was a child. He was doing the right thing. The law would step in, his parents would be held accountable, and the cycle of exploitation would finally end. He clicked send with a steady hand. He imagined the agents arriving at dawn, the look on Arthur's face as the handcuffs clicked shut. He felt like a hero. He walked out of the cafe and caught the first bus to Chicago. He sat by the window, watching the gray city fade into the distance. He felt free. 2 weeks later, Ethan sat in a small apartment in Chicago, his laptop open. He searched for news of the arrest. He found a headline, but it wasn't what he expected. Investigation dropped in Miller tax fraud case. Ethan's heart stopped. He read the article. The IRS had reviewed the files, but because the Shell Corporation had been billing Ethan's labor, and Ethan had signed the time cards, signatures Arthur had forged for years, the agency had determined that Ethan was the primary beneficiary of the fraud. The whistleblower email had been flagged as a confession. His parents had turned the tables one last time. They had claimed Ethan was the mastermind, that he had forced them to sign the documents under duress, using his deteriorating mental health as a shield. The IRS wasn't looking for Arthur and Eleanor. They were looking for Ethan Miller for 10 years of back taxes and corporate fraud. The betrayal was complete. By trying to use the system to save himself, he had handed them the rope to hang him. He was now a fugitive, his name blacklisted, his stolen earnings now the target of a federal seizure. He had lost everything he thought he had won. He sat in the dark, the sound of the L train screaming overhead, realizing that you can't outrun a parasite that has already eaten your heart. He stood up and walked to the window. The Chicago skyline was a forest of steel and glass, cold and indifferent. He had no money, no name, and a federal warrant with his face on it. But as he looked at the buildings, he didn't feel like crying. He felt a strange, sharp clarity. He knew how to build things, and he knew how to hide them. He picked up a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. He began to draw. Not a house, not a warehouse, a fortress. 1, he whispered, the lead scratching against the paper. 2, 3. The count began again. But this time, he wasn't counting the steps to an exit. He was counting the floors of the life he was going to build in the shadows, where no one, not the law, and especially not his family, would ever find him again. The sun began to rise over the lake, a sliver of gold cutting through the Chicago gray. Ethan Miller, the man who didn't exist, kept drawing. He was free, not because he was safe, but because he finally knew exactly what he was worth. And it was more than any ledger could ever hold.